Hello and welcome to the channel, where today we're going to have a look at what kinds of things separate the top tournament players. And so I'm joined by a friend of mine who's a great player, Warmaster Kareem. How are you today?
I'm very well. Thank you for having me. I think the description of me as a good player is somewhat dubious, but I try.
Well, you actually are kind of the perfect person to have on for this video, I think, because you get a really unique perspective as a prominent member of the London Wargaming Guild, because you end up playing a lot of newer players, mid-tier players, but you also play some of the best players in London, and dare I say, even the world. So you actually do get this really cool and unique perspective. So I'm really glad to have you on, man.
Really excited to have this chat. I think it's also worth noting here that we're going quite high level because this is aimed for beginners players. So you might think things like, movement in the charge phase is really important, or making sure you consolidate correctly. It's all that stuff, really beautiful, juicy stuff. It is really important. But we're going to miss a whole bunch of the minutiae and the granular stuff because we're just going to look at high level, what kind of things you should be thinking about.
Yeah, and I think this video is also aimed at getting. I'm making this video selfishly because I am a 3 and 2er. That is where I sit, and I want to get to that 4 on 1 or Emperor willing 5 and 0 at some point. And so that's what I think this video is aimed at. And I think there are a lot of people, of course, that fit that band, that 3 and 2, 2 and 3, and that they want to go that bit further.
Am I allowed to hit you with an anecdote?
Anecdote me away, yeah.
Sweet. A little bit about me. So I'm the head of community at the London Wargaming Guild and the head of 40k. So that sort of runs the gamut from being a TO at some RTTs and majors, helping some of our players practice for tournaments, and also running lots of narrative campaigns and beginner events. So like Ed says, I'm really privileged that I get to play into breadth with people. So how I got into competitive, I used to play my Black Legion all the time, and I love my Black Legion.
Yeah.
I got a Baden for my 8th birthday. There was actually huge clumps of green stuff around his joints where his arms were, because his arms kept falling off.
In black and gold and green stuff reborn.
Yeah, literally. And the green stuff wasn't even painted. It was just pure green slathered on by 8-year-old me. But so I was kind of getting sick of getting beaten with my Black Legion. So I asked Boris, who owns Badman Cafe and placed 5th at LVO, Boris, what can I do to become a better player? And he said, play me. And I learned a lot from that. I haven't really looked back since. So the 4 kind of key things from there Boris first helped teach me are threat ranges, so knowing what can hit you and what you can hit. That links into trading effectively, so knowing how to take out their stuff with your stuff in the most efficient way possible. The next one is game knowledge, so knowing what stuff does what kind of gotchas your enemy's got, what kind of damage you can expect their units to do, what kind of damage you can expect your units to do. And the last one is sort of a 4th point, is mentality. So just making sure you don't tilt, but also having the courage to call out your opponents on dubious calls.
Yeah.
So we'll go back to my anecdote about playing against Boris. I took a fairly fluffy list. And whilst my army performed okay in the table, I got absolutely destroyed on points. And one of the things he said to me is, you need to think about threat ranges. You haven't asked me once how far X, Y, Z can move. You haven't asked me how far my Talos can move. You've moved everything into my range whilst you had range on me in the first place. So we can sort of break threat ranges down into firstly, how far my units can move and what it can hit, and how far the enemy units can move and what they can hit.
I think it's a good point because I think that a lot of people don't like pre-measuring, and they don't like measuring how far their opponents are away from them, etc. And I think that people always get surprised when they get charged earlier on because they actually don't realise the 15 inches. That's enough room for a Space Marine to make a charge. So you really have to constantly be pre-measuring.
For sure, and I'll give you an example which came up really recently. So I was playing against a Knight player, and they thought I'd have to commit a bunch of Nurglings around one flank to screen out a charge. But I didn't have to screen out an entire flank. I just said, look, what's your max move? And obviously, I know a Knight player has full tilt. So it was a Chaos Knight player. So I asked, do you have the Sinesh Throne? Are you Infernal? Like, what ways can you buff your movement and your charge? And then he was like, yes, I have both of those things, which accounts for an additional 3 inches of movement. And I was like, okay, great. So I know the exact threat range of the flank, and I just need to make sure that the area it could cover is blocked by the Nurglings, because I know it's not going to fly all the way around. And I pre-measured every single bit of it. At the start of my movement phase, I asked for that. I laid out a bunch of dice with a screen I'd have to draw against it, and I managed to screen out that threat range effectively, because I knew what the threat range was. I could just respond to it effectively.
I think that by doing this, you'll also help yourself see what's going to happen in the following turn. One of the things you'll notice when you do this is that eventually your opponent is going to hit your lines, but you'll actually be able to tell yourself with what. So you'll know, if you pre-measure in your turn 1, you'll know that turn 2, your opponent is going to get into range of certain things, and you know what you'll lose, and then that'll allow you to formulate your strategy for going forward.
Absolutely, and we'll come on to this a little bit in game knowledge, because it sort of comes down to seeing the future, so to speak. And again, so because you want to potentially use this to your advantage, you want to know what the threat ranges are of your opponent and force certain units to respond, so you can dictate what response you're getting. For example, if your opponent has a really quick moving unit around the center of the board and you don't want that threatening particular objectives later, you can force it to come across to an objective by moving a cheap throwaway unit of yourself that's fast there. So it's pretty straightforward. You don't want your opponent to hit you for free. You don't want their most effective weapons to always be in range. You want to make them have to either move stuff out of position or move into retaliation range. So you need to know what range your stuff's effective at and what range their stuff's effective at. Because if you aren't aware of the threat ranges, you can never trade effectively, which is our next point.
I think this point sounds simple, but it can't be oversold.
Yeah.
Because also there's going to be an extreme situation here where you can actually position in such a way that your opponent won't be able to do anything for the next turn if they just can't get into combat and they're a combat army, for example.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ed. So I think a big part of it is if you know what your opponent's threat range is, you can really smartly make decisions about whether or not you need to be in it. Do I need to be here to take an objective? If not, let me stay 24 inches away from this big blob. It's really important to making sure your army can stay alive for as long as possible.
Yeah, and I also was just thinking, in terms of playing around a lot of big things, one of the things you can do here is that if you know the threat range of Mortarion, put one thing in that threat range, right? And then draw Mortarion out, and then you can end up trading for him. Which actually leads us on quite nicely to our second point, which is around trading, right?
Yeah, and again, you can see how closely that's linked to threat ranges.
Certainly.
So what does trading mean? Trading means when you give up a unit to kill a unit, essentially. So I can give an example of an excellent trade and then a bad trade to help illustrate it.
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's say I have Mortarion, but somehow he's up in your lines, turn 1, turn 2. And you're a Death Guard player and you think, well, I would like to crack open that Rhino to get at the Retributors inside of my PPCs. So I'm going to fly Morty up and charge him in. You crack open the Rhino, and then next turn, you're going to be able to shoot the Retributors with your Plagueburst Crawlers. In the following turn, Morty is torn down by a squad of Repentia, who will absolutely do him one. And that's a really terrible trade, because you traded Morty for a Rhino, and maybe your opponent has had to expose the Repentia to take out Morty. They'll be exposed to line of fire, so they'll get traded in turn. But that's a really effective trade for him, based on points and based on actual unit ability. Whereas the flip side of that is, for the Sisters pair, that's a wonderful trade. So they've traded a squad of Repentia, assuming they get taken out next turn, Mortarion. That's a wonderful trade for them. They've lost a unit, but the unit they've lost is of far less value to them than what the DG player, the Death Guard players, just lost. Sometimes when you've got units in Deep Strike and your opponent effectively screens them out from good threats because they know the threat range of the Deep Striking unit, you have no choice but to trade them for something dreadful. For example, Joe Moscadini, lovely guy, plays Blood Angels, came second at the last No Retreat. We were playing a game of Black Legion versus Blood Angels, and he knew exactly the threat range of the Obliterators, which allowed him to force me into terrible trade. He knows they're only 24 inches, he knows they're coming in from Deep Strike, so he screens them out, makes sure that I've got to land 9 inches away, and that my 24 inches can't hit any of his good units. Can't hit any of his Death Company, can't hit his Repulsor, can't hit his Sangard. So they just plop down, blow up an Impulse. The choices are Impulsor and Cursors, and then they get nuked the next turn. And that's 400, 500 points with full support. And it's just trading for 1 or 2 Impulsors. It super feels bad, see. And that's how you can use threat ranges to trades for your opponent.
If you're new to trading, one of the things I would probably recommend is putting in a couple of cheaper units into your army list. And the reason this is really beneficial is it allows you to practice trading right from the off. So one of the things I wouldn't recommend you doing is you moving your most tanky, powerful unit that you have onto a forward objective turn 1. If your opponent is Admech, you're, for example, something with a lot of firepower, they have enough firepower to remove that unit, whether it's Deathwing Terminators or a squad of Guardsmen. So go, so if you've got Deathwing Terminators, for example, put a squad of 5 Intercessors forward first. Your opponent then will come out, kill the Intercessors, you've baited them, and this then allows you to trade. Trading also works in terms of shooting, right? So then you bring out your heavy hitters, you kill the biggest things that are a threat to your tough unit, and then your tough unit can be on that point, and you've traded effectively here. And it's also, I think, worth mentioning that trading doesn't have to be synonymous with points, because one of the other things that I'm sure everyone will have seen if they've watched a bat rep is they'll have seen someone say, oh, well, I'm going to go for this unit because this is all of their obsec that they have left. So that's a great example of where there's another attribute here that's really important in the game. And so maybe don't always trade for points, and actually losing a expensive unit to kill their obsec can often be the right play. So there's definitely things you can look for here.
That's a really, really good point, Ed. And I think, so that's the first thing to take away from that is what gives a unit value. And it depends, but if it's a unit that really allows your opponent to play the mission, and if seeing into the future you think it will be vital in contesting an objective, it becomes really effective to take out that unit. And also, something which can add value to a target is whether or not it can take you out. So for example, if I'm playing Chaos Knight suit with my demons, and my opponent has very limited anti-tank, maybe I want to take out all of that as soon as I can, because it allows my knights to stomp around unopposed if they haven't been able to screen me out well. So yeah, there's lots of different things that can add value. And yeah, I think you've absolutely hit the nail on the head there with the classic example. People are like, I flew Magnus ahead of the lines. He's a beast. He'll be fine. And he gets one shot.
So let's go on to point number 3.
I mean, this is a great chance for you to plug as we go along. This one. But game knowledge. And there's 2 big facets to it. But to look into the future effectively, you got to know what everything does. Even before the game. You need to know what stuff is killy, what kind of gotchas, what kind of tricks your opponent has. And eat fair, and it is really hard. I mean, even I was playing a bunch at the end of 8th, and I've really messed up to a lack of game knowledge before. For example, Custodians can take away d6 from your charge roll with a tripwire grenade.
Tanglefoot grenade.
Tanglefoot grenade, that's it, sorry. So something like that as well. You've really got to know it if you're Assault Army.
Yeah. Yeah, it ends the game.
And it's a tough one to coach, because I'm not a coach by any means, but I've seen good players do stuff. So I know what they do, and a lot they ask their opponent. But the thing is that there's a lot of variance in what response you get, right?
Yeah, I think that's the most important thing, is that as you say, is asking your opponent. So have you got anything that can get across the board to here? Turn 1, that's always a very valuable question. Have you got anything that ignores line of sight when it shoots? These kind of things. But I guess I don't really have a perfect answer for you. And I've watched plenty of top players play games, and it's pretty common that even on those tables people forget stratagems, etc., etc. I guess your best defense is to just watch those bat reps. I think one of the things that was kind of my philosophy behind making this channel with the gotcha guides was that you don't have to know everything, is the other thing I would say. So you don't have to know that Space Marines have a strat where 6 to hit will auto wound, because only in Death is Duty End, comparatively, it's going to be huge in a lot of games.
I will say that is something, though, you need to have at least some knowledge of what armies roughly do. So don't have massive anxiety. You don't need to know every single stratagem. No one does. But you need to know a couple of the key kickers.
Yeah. No,
that's it. You don't have to know everything. Don't be anxious if you don't know everything. Because if you don't know anything, you can ask your opponent, what can fall back and charge? What can target my characters? What can reduce my charge range? Stuff like that. And tailor it to the army. For example, if it's a quick army, what in particular is really quick? Why is it quick?
Yeah.
But yeah, and there are awesome resources out here. Obviously, we can plug the Sandman's awesome channel, which we're on right now, with his wonderful gotcha videos. Goonhammer as well.
Yeah.
Their start competing
Kinks.
articles gives you an idea of, yeah, exactly. It gives you an idea of what stuff does. And even if you know something's really prevalent in your local meta, it doesn't hurt to read up a little bit on it. If you know AdMech are crushing it in your local scene,
Yeah.
take a look at why.
Yeah, and I've been really fortunate in that I've met quite a few content creators who made competitively focused bat reps and videos, etc. And one of the things that I found super interesting was that they watch bat reps themselves, and they do it so they get a better knowledge of how the game works. So I think that even if you're just watching those turn 1s and turn 2s of bat reps, that's going to really help you out for tournaments, because you're going to see a lot of the key plays of some top armies.
Yeah, that's a great shout. Bat reps are a great resource, especially when they're bat reps that are deliberately geared to be competitive.
Yeah, and of course, this also means make sure you know the core rules as well, I guess, is the other thing we should mention briefly, because there are so many nuances to the rules. It's a really good idea to get used to knowing the rules, but also feeling free to check rules in tournaments. Don't be afraid to be like, can we just check that's how the pistol rule works? Because you might not have seen the pistol rule be used on a significant unit before, so it's always worth checking. Or, consolidation, pylons, these kind of things that are massive.
For sure. And you shouldn't be afraid to call over a TO. Obviously, you don't want to scruple everything, but if you're fairly unsure about it, whenever I'm called over as a TO, I don't really even have to know the rule. I just say, what does the rule say? I read the rule, see what it says, and a lot of times you can sort of work out just by paying close attention to the rules.
Yeah.
And just working out how they interact from there. So just reading your own rules so you have an intimate understanding, and because you don't want to think one of your unit special rules works a particular way, and then find out that it doesn't at a tournament. So that's the other big bit of game knowledge, knowing what your stuff does, knowing what the special rules are. And then also, for you to be able to trade effectively, you also want to know what the rough outputs of some key units are. What's killy?
True. There are an increasing number of MathHammer apps and websites out there. If you're in that 1 hour before a tournament, if you're playing something with a lot of fire output, it's probably worth just mathing out how much of your stuff do you expect to survive if you go into line of sight. Because then you can at least... Because you don't have to be a maths genius to know 40k, but a bit of mathematical knowledge, I think, is certainly advantageous. And one of the things that you can then do is you go, oh, okay, so now I know that he's only going to have 4 of those models into range, and so then you can take a fraction of that.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point, and I really like the particular point you made about doing it for your opponent. Doing it based on what your opponent is. And this is something I'm really lazy, so I do. But I've had top players, when I've been matched against them round 1 of either day 1 or day 2, message me beforehand about my list, clarifying something.
That's interesting.
I've had them reach out to me on social media or text me or whatever and be like, hey dude, what's the gimmick with this list? I can't quite work it out. What stratagems are you using? Things like that. But I think that the more common version of that is researching what your opponent's army does before you face it. I often see people post on group chats I'm part of, playing this round 1. Any thoughts?
That's a great shout, actually. That's a really great shout. Yeah, put it in the WhatsApp group. And I do think it's worth pointing out that it's fine to ask your opponent if they give up any secondaries in their list, for example. So you might find out that they have a bunch of vehicles for Bring It Down, or you can take no prisoners against them and get a load of points. I think it's always worth having that conversation.
Oh, for sure.
As we're talking about game knowledge, of course, the thing that all top tournament players are going to do is have a plan for secondary and primary. So make sure you know in a hold 1 and a hold 2 and a hold 2, hold 3. That's the more difficult one. And have a plan as to what secondaries you can play into. That's obviously going to be a massive thing.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. Actually, that's entirely right, and it goes both ways. Trying to limit the secondaries that can be scored against you, or knowing what the secondaries that can be scored against you are and trying to limit that.
Yeah.
For example, the classic is, I've seen loads of people bait people and taking Bring It Down, and they'll never score it because of the way you play your vehicles.
Yeah.
So just having some awareness of the need to play around secondaries is huge in this edition.
No, yeah, it is super important. And then let's go on to the final point then, something I thought that was fascinating that you wanted to talk about, which is mentality.
Yeah. So I have another anecdote for you here. So one of the last tournaments I was at, so I was 3-1 going into my final game, and I would have been on shot for potentially a podium, depending on my scoring, with a 4-1, if I hadn't lost the game. And I lost the game, I think, in big part due to something I didn't push back on. It was a tough pill to swallow, and I sort of afterwards, at the weekend, I was like, when the weekend ended, I was like, why didn't I just call the TO? And a big part of that is confidence, I think. Confidence in your game knowledge. And another example is there's literally the same tournament. A player a couple of tables down of me who placed really high actually called out their opponent and said, look, dude, I know what you're trying to do here. You don't have the move for that.
Yeah.
And he was right. But just having that confidence is really hard, especially if you're slightly new to the scene, right?
Yeah, it can be tough. And I think I do have one piece of advice here, which actually links back to what we were talking about earlier about pre-measuring.
Mm-hmm.
So when I'm pre-measuring, often I'll show my opponent just how far away my units are from their units, so they can actually see just how many inches they'll need to make in order to get a charge, or what that charge is likely to be, if they're going to just move and charge, or if they can move and advance and charge. Because if you, for example, move and advance and charge, if you do all of that without pre-measuring first, you've moved the model multiple times, and even without intending to, you could have shortened or widened that gap by 1 or 2 inches. And so this is actually a good way of just avoiding any kind of confusion there.
And that's something that's really relevant to all the points we've made so far, playing by intent.
Yeah.
So often I'll say something like, look, your bike has got a 30-inch range on its guns.
Yeah.
Here's 30 inches. Here's a dice. I'm putting my model just out of that.
Yeah.
So you can't get me next turn if I don't move. And they'll be like, yep, sounds good.
Yeah.
And then if I see them moving to hit the unit, I'm like, oh, remember, we did pre-measure that. Because I don't want them to waste their move either.
Yeah.
If we've agreed on it. Do you know what I mean?
It's not even that sometimes people will, because I think I've been very fortunate in that I don't think anyone's ever cheated against me. People do make mistakes and people do get things wrong all of the time. Of course they do. And so one of the things that is big when playing by intent is to be able to push back, as you say. And it's not a matter of you saying like, I think you're playing this wrong deliberately. It's a matter of someone saying like, okay, so all of these have got line of sight on your character there, and you go, actually, have you, or whatever. So I think it is, like you said, their confidence, having the confidence to be able to push back. And look, a lot of the time you've got to be prepared that you're going to be wrong. But the thing is, it doesn't matter.
And I think that's a really key point to make here. So that player who made the mistake against me, it was a genuine mistake. So many of this stuff is unintentional.
Yeah.
And you do have a subconscious bias to want your stuff to be in line of sight or whatever, and you can't control that. So it helps it make it a fairer game if you call stuff out. And the thing is, this doesn't apply to casual and now, because if something can't quite see something in a casual, if I'm playing a narrative game, but I think it should,
for sure,
from a fluffy perspective, I don't care. But in the tournament setting, and a lot of this mentality stuff, it comes down to sportsmanship as well, because there is the flip side where I think, in my opinion, because of sporting etiquette, you also have a duty to remind your opponent if they're forgetting beneficial rules.
Fair.
And you can sort of try and warn your opponents about stuff if you're playing by intent, because often I'll move a scary, like a greater demon, and I'll be like, you cannot be in range of this objective whilst also being out of heroic intervention range, for example.
Yeah. Interesting. Let's talk about mentality a bit more then, because you were talking before, off camera, off recording, about how the people that constantly say they have bad luck lose.
I completely agree.
You can have unlucky games. Your dice can lose you a game, and you can certainly not make a lot of the key rolls. But regularly on every tournament you go to is pushing it, definitely.
Yeah, it's unlikely. But the thing is, the dice can occasionally just absolutely screw your game. You might have a really unlucky run. And the key thing is not resigning. Because I've seen so many players, especially newer players, they've got their eye fixed on one thing, and then when it goes badly wrong, they go, oh, well, that's it. And part of that comes into, it's less, you won't get tilted as much if you have redundancy in your game plan. So if you've got a couple of things that you could do, and if the things that should work don't, you can still squeeze out a couple of points. Because even if it's all going wrong, you should always be thinking, how can I get more points here?
No, for sure, yeah. And I think the other time people get tilted is when they feel like they're really far behind on the points. And yet we've all won games where we were like, wasn't I down by like 25 points at some point? Because it really can happen. I think especially if you're going second, because you get that last turn scoring, it's pretty much always worth playing on if you can. And I know it can be tough at a tournament.
For sure, I'm in a massive position of privilege where I can play loads of Warhammer against such an amazing array of people. And I do really hope they enjoy our games because I love all of it. I love the lore, I love the modeling, I love the painting, I love the playing.
Yeah.
And I mean, Stephen Box spoke about it on the Conclave episode. But I do really think that, the competitive scene has got a bad rep, and I have met so many amazing people, even like people who've made mistakes against me, whatever. It happens. And the biggest thing you can do, more important than any of this stuff we told you, is to get involved.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that you mentioned right at the start that we should probably draw more attention to was that you played against really top players to get better, and that's a huge deal. Like, that's the only way you're going to properly learn.
Get stuck in, go to tournaments, play games, reach out to people who are good at your army. Get stuck in the community, and that's how you if you immerse yourself in it, you will learn so quickly.
Awesome. Well, that's all been absolutely fantastic. As I say, I'm trying to get much better, and I'm trying to get much better whilst playing GSC. So it's an interesting time for me personally. But I think all of this is super valuable advice, and I hope it was really great advice for everybody listening. Thank you so much for coming on, Kareem.
Thank you so much for having me. I mean, obviously we've known each other for a while now, and it's always a pleasure to talk 40k with you.
Yeah, well, absolutely. We are two people who just love talking Warhammer 40k. And obviously you can find Kareem on Instagram at WarMasterKareem. And I hope this video was useful to everybody watching, and I'll see you for the next one. Thanks for watching.